with that, I just want to mention that this is a three-part series, really targeting financial advisors, broker dealers or financial institutions, insurance companies, and software companies. How do we really make sure we understand how secure a software vendor is as it relates to managing our data in compliance with SEC, FINRA, and New York DFS regulation and guidance? So today we're going to talk primarily about vendor risk assessments and then introduce application penetration testing. A month from now, 4 weeks from now, on Tuesday, February 25th, we're going to dive deep into what does secure software development and cloud management look like? How do I ensure that I'm properly managing that software lifecycle from a security standpoint? And how do I make sure that I'm managing the cloud environments, whether that be AWS or Azure or the Google Cloud platform, in order to ensure that we have secure clouds. And then in March, the March 25th, the fourth Tuesday in March, we'll talk about effective application penetration, going deeper on what we introduced today. Anything you'd want to add to that, Vincent, before you introduce yourself?
No, it's good. So thank you, Paul. Great introduction. I'm here to support you in that amazing presentation about something that is critical for vendor risk management. And I'd like to start with maybe talk a little bit about the flow down regulation. You know, if we go to that slide directly, that's slide number 6. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I mean, with OpenVRM that we'll discuss and also vendor risk management in general, I heard a lot of people think that doing vendor risk management is having a list of vendor. That's 80% of people. And then the other 20, they say, oh, I asked them their SOC to report. But when you look at really what's happening with regulators is they don't ask us just to look at if the vendors have a report. What they ask us is to say, look, you have to meet these regulations and you have to ensure that your vendors meet the same regulation. So the scope of that vendor due diligence or vendor risk management is way bigger than most people understand it. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. So what we'll cover in the 3 sessions is really one side of it, but remember that there's more. If you go to the next slide, first the regulators are telling you, the clients, the clients of those vendors, that you need to create policies and procedures. So based on the regulation, you have a certain list of tasks to do. And then to manage your risk. So it's not just to say you have a SOC to report, it's to review the reports and the network penetration testing and a lot of other elements to say, what's my risk, depending on what do I do with that vendor, what information do I share with that vendor. Another point that is interesting is before onboarding. So a lot of clients, they sign up with the vendor and after they start to look at the vendor risk management, and regulators are clear. They say that you should perform vendor risk management before you select a vendor and through your relationship with that vendor, because it's not a one time also, it's every year.
And can I add something there, Vincent? You, the financial institutions that are on the call, you have the most leverage with the vendors before you sign the agreement. They want your business. They want to get to that agreement that's going to pay the salesperson, and that will sign you up as a client. So truly do take that time to ensure that you're doing the vendor risk management. Vincent's going to lead us through here. And then if there are any deficiencies that vendor has, you can then, if they're red, it's something is a showstopper. Here's a really super simple example. They do not support multi-factor authentication for logging into the cloud. You can make that a requirement before they sign the agreement. So you have the most leverage, as Vincent is talking about, before onboarding, to influence change that will make the vendor more secure.
The next slide is about which vendors, and we try to, when you read all the regulations, the 3 first are in all regulation. If you take your client's data and put it at the vendor, you should audit that vendor. If that vendors access your network or your location physically when there's private data, you should audit them. And New York State go further. They say if the vendor have financial information, confidential information from your firm, not necessarily from your client, you should also audit the vendor. So that's why those four questions are always at the basis of, should I do something with this vendor that is further than just reviewing contract? And then the last slide before we look at Open VRM is just to say really quick, what is it on the left side that you must know about your vendor and what it is that they should provide or demonstrate that they have for that vendor due diligence. Okay, the first one is the famous privacy notice that I would say that half the vendor that we review, they don't have that. It's a known template that should be on your website that says what information do you have, with whom do you share that information, and if you share that information, can the client opt out? That's critical and that's a requirement. Next one is typical, information security policy, and then business continuity plan, security incident response plan. And now we go to how do a vendor can demonstrate that it follows the implementation of their policies and procedure. And there's two sides of it. Some of them they do it internally, so they fig a SIG light or a SIG detail or a SIG core themselves, or they will do the full process of the SOC 2, where not only they will demonstrate and evidence their technical controls and the process to manage them, but somebody else will come and audit that and give not a certification, it's an attestation of a review. AICPA put an emphasis to say it's not a certification, it's really just an attestation. And finally, other important point, and that leads us to where we are now. So it's okay, you do those attack surface, what do we see from the internet, from website and domain name and all this, then all the scans and testing and the famous application penetration testing that we're going to cover. Okay. And I think the challenge for a lot of firms, and that's why Paul and I were involved in a free open VRM standard. So open for vendor risk management. Okay. This is a standard that we promote and it's free for vendor, free for clients. How can you manage that relationship and that exchange of documents? So open VRM is not there to perform the management or the risk or the due diligence. It's really there to allow the exchange of information. So right now we have a board on the next slide that we created. It's like we're 8 people there to make sure that it's not just Buckler. Of course, Buckler is offering the platform, but everything that you see in OpenPRM, the questionnaire, the strategy, the way that we decide to launch, as an example, the directory publicly is supported by that advisory board. And finally, what we have is to share a little bit of the progress of that platform. So what we have now is about 100, and you see it there, 1,100 vendor listed, but 150 of them participate in the Open VRM. That means that those vendors and just the most known are there. They log into the platform, they fill a questionnaire, and they support their client there. It's amazing. Now we have Schwab, and you see other name there. So it's the traction. We're reaching critical mass now. It took us about a year and a half, but we're really happy. And if you click just for the second element, Paul, the clients now. So we have 300 advisor firms that are open VRM, selecting their vendors and doing their vendor due diligence on the platform. So it's really interesting to see because the more clients we have that comes, the more vendors we have because they invite their vendors. So you see that it's a snowball effect, So really,
Yeah, and just I'd like to, as a VCISO or a fractional CISO, and as a firm that does vendor risk assessments, the more it's beautiful to see these logos, Apex, Betterment, eMoney, Schwab, FP Alpha, the others. These are vendors that many, if not all of us, not all, but many of us want to do vendor risk assessments real quick on these. Well, what Vincent is saying is these vendor risk assessments have been done, and you can ask for the completed questionnaires. You can ask for the documents that Betterment has uploaded as it relates to both attesting to their security controls that they have and evidencing that their security controls have been completed. For example, an application penetration test or an understanding of their vulnerability management program. So this work's done. It becomes about you asking for the security package. And then Vincent has created a way in the team at Buckler has created a way for you to evidence your completion of your vendor risk assessment using the information that's already there.
Exactly. So what's left is to review these documents and decide if, based on your risk, you accept to have that vendor. And annually, you will go and review those documents, you know. So Paul, back to you. That was the quick introduction on regulations and how to manage those vendors.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in one of the upcoming calls, I think it would be good to do a demonstration of
Yeah.
Open VRM. And if we even have time today, we could log in real quick. But long story short, um, now you go to complete the vendor risk assessment of Betterment, okay, or Apex, or Charles Schwab. You're reviewing their questionnaire, you're reviewing their answers, the evidence that they submitted to prove, yes, this is what we do as it relates to vulnerability management. Yes, we do application penetration testing, and here are the results, the shareable results from our last test. Um, the element of vendor risk management that I don't see a lot of independent broker dealers or firms doing in a sophisticated manner is truly understanding what vulnerabilities will that vendor bring to our organization, or how hackable. I mean, that's really what the application penetration test is going to go after. How truly secure is an organization? And good vulnerability scanning and good application penetration testing help prove how secure they are. So vulnerability management, let's just quickly compare and contrast vulnerability scanning to application penetration testing. We all should be doing vulnerability scanning. We're going to scan the hosts, the devices, the networks associated with a particular vendor or with our own organization, and we're going to determine what threats and vulnerabilities exist. So electronic truth, it's very scalable, it's quick. Application penetration testing differs in that we're going to take the results of the vulnerability scan, and where we see issues, we're going to attempt to exploit the vulnerability to prove um, uh, uh, what could that vulnerability be exploited? Could somebody get to my information? Could somebody do an attack that would result in my data being exposed to a bad actor? So vulnerability scanning is involved in kind of anything we do in cybersecurity, and application penetration testing is akin to pretending to be a hacker. Here's a slide that really kind of points out the differences. So vulnerability scanning, we're going to assess known vulnerabilities. An example might be on my web server or a third party's web server, they do not have the most up-to-date version of Apache. And if we do not have the most up-to-date version of Apache on that web server, it introduces a variety of exploits that guys like Patrick can use to gain access to that software vendor's environment. So vulnerability scanning, let's identify which vulnerabilities via electronic pulsing or scanning of the environment or the devices or the hosts. Application penetration testing, let's use those vulnerabilities and attempt to exploit them to get to the information. Vulnerability scanning is automated. Pen testing is both automated and manual. So we're going to allow the sophisticated trained tester to attempt to exploit vulnerabilities. And maybe that allows us to move into the environment, move laterally, escalate privileges, and start to do a whole bunch of potentially malicious activity. Tools involved with vulnerability scanning, Qualys, Nessus, a variety of tools made available by, who's the maker of Metasploit? Rapid7. So their product Insight VM is the most current version of vulnerability scanning. On the application penetration test, we're going to use tools like Burp Suite, Metasploit, or Nikto to attempt to compromise an application. Vulnerability scanning should be regular, ongoing, routine. It might be daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, depending upon your organization, your environment, or the software vendor that's involved that you're assessing. So vulnerability scanning is something we should be doing both in our organizations as part of a ongoing process and should be regularly scheduled. A key thing vulnerability scanning is going to point out is where do I need to patch that I am not currently patched. Application penetration testing is going to be less frequent. Again, keeping in mind it's more manual in nature. It might be something that an application does every 6 months, or an application Orion or Redtail has done annually. So it kind of depends upon the organization, the nature of the application, how much confidential data is being stored. The output of each process and vulnerability scanning, I'm sure most of you have reviewed a set of reports that describe the vulnerabilities associated with both the devices, the hosts, the computers, operating systems, and software. So those reports will point out vulnerabilities that should be remediated, and we'll talk briefly about that here in a second. And then application penetration testing will be the list of vulnerabilities, but also the set of tests that were executed against an application and evidence that the test, via the test, when we do application penetration testing, that we were able to successfully exploit the application by doing the following things. So when Patrick and my team is doing application penetration testing, they're listing vulnerabilities, they're looking at the most egregious vulnerabilities, and then they're taking screen prints of the work being done to hack your application. And then finally, of course, suggested controls or remediation should be listed as well. Pause there. Any thoughts, comments, or questions from anybody?
That's good.
Okay,
Quite
so both
complete.
these are important. Go ahead.
No, I just said that was complete.
Okay, yeah, I'll move a little bit more quickly. So, what is required as it relates to annual penetration testing? This is a slide from the New York DFS. Most of the folks that are on the call have either clients or are financial institutions that are regulated by the New York DFS. We often reference the New York DFS because it is law. It's required. It's not just guidance. As of April 29th of last year, any organization that is licensed in the state of New York, and that's most of us, should ensure that their vendors and that their organization has at least annual penetration testing from both inside your network and outside. So it's not only, so outside would be an example. You give me a list of IP addresses, and I am going to scan the devices such as web servers that are attached to the public internet. That would be an example of an outside information system boundary. Inside would be I am logging into the application where I do financial planning, and I am going to test my use of that application. So I'm going to go inside the application. Inside, of course, could imply ensuring inside your network that any vulnerabilities associated with your computers, even if it's protected by a firewall or other perimeter defenses, are being evaluated. And a key reason that is necessary is that bad actors, ethical hackers alike, once inside your organization, if there are vulnerabilities, they can use them to, say, move laterally across a poorly segmented network. They can use it to escalate privileges or use it to discover where inside your network you store the most confidential information. So important to be doing annual penetration testing from both inside and outside information system boundaries. You should have a monitoring process in place to ensure that you discover or detect new vulnerabilities. And then you should have some way, shape, or form of prioritizing those vulnerabilities and making choices about which will be remediated. If you are truly, when we're doing a risk assessment, I often hear, no, we've never had an incident, or we don't really have any vulnerabilities. We patch and do everything else we need to do to take care of threats and vulnerabilities. The reality is when somebody says that to me, I know they're really don't have a sophisticated program because we all will have a variety of vulnerabilities and threats both inside and outside our network. And we need to have some way of understanding which of those am I going to remediate and by when. Um, just a little bit deeper dive on vulnerability management. You see this 500.5, that is a section of the New York DFS code requiring all of us to have vulnerability management programs. Again, we're attempting to detect weaknesses, i.e., the common example is, unpatched or outdated operating systems, and then we want to remediate those things. Your annual risk assessment process should result in the review of vulnerability management reports, scanning reports, um, and uh, and it should evidence that you have a process for addressing those vulnerabilities. As it relates to application penetration testing, I mean, I think I've kind of killed that, mentioned that quite a bit. There's a variety of different types of penetration testing, some automated, some manual. Everything involves vulnerability scanning. And for all intents and purposes, good penetration testing involves a human or increasingly probably going forward into the future, artificial intelligence that is truly attempting to hack you like a bad actor would do. There is often, some confusion about, hey, well, yeah, we do penetration testing. We have, Nessus do scanning on our network, so therefore I've completed a pen test. A network penetration test is a manual test that attempts to exploit the network vulnerabilities identified. When you think penetration testing, you think I run my scans and now I'm going to use the results of those scans to exploit some vulnerability identified. Um, I reference here also dynamic application security testing. That is one of the sets of automated scanning that we will talk about on our next call. So, for those of us that are building software, we're going to want to make sure that we understand what pre-compile and post-compile testing is taking place to ensure that common coding mistakes are not introduced into production. So for example, if I have an input box that I use an application, it's on the web, I sign in. Now I have a variety of input boxes that allow for me to query a client and bring back their net worth. If I'm in a portfolio management and financial planning application, later in these slides, we're going to take you through a case study of an actual penetration test. But those input boxes should do it should allow for controlled inputs. So when the user of the application enters a unique client identifier, that is all that it'll only take a certain type of input versus say something where there is nothing protecting the input boxes and I can just enter my own SQL code saying, select all from tables X, Y, and Z, and it'll literally bring back the data in the database, because our application is just a front end to our database. So we want to make sure we're doing testing to ensure that common coding problems are addressed. Threats and vulnerabilities affecting, let's give some examples of the kinds of things, the threats and vulnerabilities that vulnerability scanning or application penetration testing would discover. And this will become more apparent as we get into the case study a little bit later in the slides. Vulnerability scanning, we're going to make sure that our infrastructure and the software that is part of our domain, part of our environment, that we are using secure versions of software, that infrastructure meaning, computers, servers, networking devices, that they are properly patched, that firmware is up to date. So all these basic things that we should make sure that on a weekly and monthly basis we're fixing, that we don't introduce any infrastructure or software issues. I'm using an out-of-date version of um, of common software, even the Adobe suite of tools, or I want to make sure that I don't have old versions of the software that have known vulnerabilities. Whereas the application penetration test, it's going to look at business logic errors or errors that in how we configure our application our APIs, to ensure that our APIs don't allow for easy access to confidential data that they should not. We'll get into that into the case study. From an access control perspective, making sure that we do not have weak access controls. So I have an application that is only used in the United States. It would be a weak access configuration to allow anybody in the world to access my application. Most of you are using Azure or AWS. There are a variety of great scanning tools we can use to identify vulnerabilities associated with our access controls. On the application penetration testing side, we're going to look more at who is allowed to be authenticated to our application, and then based upon their role, what are they authorized to do. Many applications that are built, especially in this fintech environment, really don't spend enough time thinking through the logic associated with role-based access and other methods of ensuring that only the person that should be able to access that information or data or perform a certain function in my software is allowed to do that. Vulnerability scanning will look for, misconfigurations. I referenced some of them related to access controls, but there can be other misconfigurations as it relates to our entire environment. And application penetration testing will go deep on injection attacks. I gave you one example. Does an application allow for SQL queries, to be performed? And we'll talk a little bit more about cross-site scripting, or cross-site request forgery exploits as well. Um, and we're going to share a version of these slides as well, right? Because some of these are pretty technical. And we'll make sure that you have a copy of these, because it'll be a good reference material for you as it relates to, okay, I want to make sure that my vulnerability scanning is detecting out-of-date software versions or unpatched systems. Obviously, most any vulnerability scanning software is going to allow for that to happen. I'm going to make sure that my vulnerability scanning is looking for misconfigured cloud services. In December of this year, CISA gave us a lot of good advice around AWS and Azure in particular about tools that can be used to scan your cloud environments and detect misconfigurations that might allow a bad actor to get into your Office 365 environment. Good scanning is going to look for weak or default credentials. Just a super simple example. A lot of people work from home these days. Run out to Best Buy, buy a wireless access point, and the default, password for that wireless access point when I bring it home from the store or buy it from Amazon is, and you can just Google what the default admin credentials are for a variety of networking devices that we use in our small businesses or medium-sized businesses. We want to make sure that those default credentials have been changed. And in addition to out-of-date software and unpatched systems, we're going to look for unsecured ports. And as we do risk assessments, it is a bit astonishing how often we see, port 3389 or other remote ports designed to allow for remote access not being properly configured. or we might also via vulnerability scanning get some information as it relates to application misconfigurations. On the last application penetration test we did, we found missing security headers that are easy to be remediated, but most organizations don't know how to necessarily do that themselves. Poorly configured encryption in transit, using out of date versions of TLS that have been since deprecated. So really, I think that I have encryption in transit, but I don't because I need to upgrade to TLS version 1.3 or higher. That is a really common example that we see in the risk assessments that we do. And then API related issues as well.
And Paul, I just want to add something here that we saw lately, and we were surprised if you go back the slide before, is the
Yeah.
CSP, Content Security Policy. So when we see this, we all think, oh, it's a web developer or it's a software company, but your website has CSP and you have to configure them properly. If not, any audit from security scorecard or an insurance company will tell you, oh, you're not secure. And you're like, what do you mean I'm not secure? I don't have any software that I'm developing, and they say your website is not secure, and we know that somebody can hack your website and from there access information or do some other actions. But CSP is something you're going to hear more and more. So I encourage everybody to look even at their corporate website for that.
Agreed. And many services come native with platforms like Microsoft. So, for example, Microsoft's remote procedure call or server message block. These services allow your computers, both inside and outside your network, to talk with one another. These services also allow one computer to make a request that another computer do something on its behalf. Many we often see clients that leave some of these services that come native with the Microsoft environment just open and available on the open internet. And bad actors can use and exploit those available services to perform a ransomware attack. So, really important that we this is quite technical, kind of heavy content. It's important to engage with people like Patrick and others so that we're doing more than just gathering a SOC 2 Type 2 when we're assessing the risk associated with a vendor. We're actually really thinking about how might a bad actor exploit and get to my information at that vendor. Um, Obviously also, lack of multi-factor authentication or improperly or overly permissive identity and access management roles in a cloud environment. Those are also very common misconfigurations we see. So, work with firms like us to scan your environments. There are both free and paid for tools that allow any cloud environment or applications to be checked, and then you get a report of knowing what vulnerabilities and threats do I have and how should I update them or remediate them. Okay, the last thing I'll mention here before we actually get more into some of the case studies is um, there are software or vulnerabilities associated with software are published on the open internet for all to access, you and bad actors, right? So this the go out to and Google CVE if you don't know what this is, common vulnerability enumeration databases that show for WordPress or for Oracle's product XYZ or for Apache. These are the known vulnerabilities and the severity of those vulnerabilities. So as you're using software, it is easy for you to come to understand via scanning tools and also via these databases that exist what vulnerabilities are associated with a specific type of software. Um, and uh, and this common understanding and prioritization of like which vulnerabilities are most risky This scoring system allows the software that we use to do vulnerability scanning to present the results in a meaningful way. Um, Now, from an application penetration testing, just real quickly, I want to highlight now what are we looking at when we're doing application penetration testing versus vulnerability scanning? We're looking for flaws in the application's logic. And that might be, for example, yep, MFA is in place on an application, but after the 5,000, on the 5,001th attempt to use MFA, you actually don't need it. Or using the application logic to transfer funds. So when I was asking Patrick, because he's our key application penetration tester at the Security Basecamp, how much time do you take getting to know the application and the series of screens and the workflow associated with an application and doing reconnaissance on an application before actually starting your ethical hacking and the scanning you do. And he said about 25% of the total engagement is just getting to know that application and its business logic. Um, we also want to, of course, look at APIs allow for exchange of information between different systems or environments. So it is obvious that APIs would be target of a bad actor because it's a way that I can get into. Oftentimes, it's a published way for me to access confidential data in your application. So we're going to want to make sure that we have API related endpoints properly secured and that we have proper API configurations in place. I also earlier I referenced just making sure that we properly set up authentication authorization. It's a fundamental set of concepts associated with cybersecurity. Who has the right to access this application? And then once they have access, who is authorized to make money movement transactions? Or who is authorized to create a new user? Who is authorized to make changes in logging parameters? And all of these sorts of things they're important concepts that, if not properly set up and configured in your applications, can result in exploitation and injection attacks. Whoops, injection attacks. What is that right
Mhm.
there? SQL injection attacks, command injection targeting back-end cloud services. Patrick, anything you'd want to add to some of these examples around application penetration tests to kind of make application penetration tests come to life for some of the attendees?
The only thing I would add here, I think the real benefit of the application penetration test over the vulnerability scanning is really what we're out to prove is what is the impact if an attacker could exploit that application, right? And what that helps you do is inform your risk assessment better. Because just because you have a vulnerability that is, high in severity, um, you know, we can take a holistic look at it through the application penetration test and prove that maybe you have some other controls in place that mitigate that. And um, that can lower the severity of a vulnerability, possibly making your risk assessment, um, you know, even higher quality, right? Because you have you prove that there's a lower impact to that exploitation. So when we're working through all these different, um, categories of checks that we do during an application pen test, we're really doing a deep dive, right? We're not looking at it on a surface level. We're doing a deep examination to really, benefit your business in various ways.
Yeah. So Patrick is also heavily involved in vulnerability management at a very large financial services organization, and I do remember when I met you 3 to 4 years ago when you were the professor of a cybersecurity boot camp that I was in. You talked about so often we're presenting vulnerabilities to business owners or even CISOs, especially in very large organizations that might not really understand. It's difficult to remediate everything, right? So, an application penetration test, because you're actually attempting to exploit a vulnerability, and you come to know the other set of castled controls that might be in place, layered controls that might be in place. Hey, this is a high vulnerability. It would cost us, 160 hours to remediate it, but here is why it is not very exploitable and how we are going to choose to accept this vulnerability. That's a good use of an application penetration test as well. So let's get into a fictitious kind of as we end our the set of content we want to discuss in. Let's bring it to life by a real life example. So most, if not all of us, use financial planning software, portfolio management software. We're going to fictitiously call this project or this company the Advisor Portal. We've got a FinTech company that provides portfolio management, financial planning software to independent financial advisors. It allows for client onboarding, portfolio analysis, investment tracking, goal tracking, etc. It seamlessly integrates with things like Fidelity and Schwab. Key findings that we're going to illustrate, and we'll show you specific examples, would be some business logic flaw that would allow a bad actor to change a client's portfolio. The asset allocation associated with that portfolio. A very common set of findings you might see in an application penetration test is insecure direct object references, which would allow a bad actor to query and access client data. And we'll show that example and how that worked. Insufficient security on client reports. A couple 4 years ago, doing vulnerability or vendor risk management on one of the leading CRM applications in our industry. It was possible to, depending upon what you used in Google to query, because improperly secured S3 buckets at AWS were set up, you could literally pull back a client's net worth statement or confidential information about where they had money, their social security numbers, by just, in this case, via literally a Google search. And then, of course, obviously, just making sure that multi-factor authentication is in place. When we do, I will say something about MFA when we're doing application penetration testing, because in some cases, once the reconnaissance phase is done and we're actually quote unquote ethically hacking the application, there may be a series of hundreds of electronic tests that are being performed. We will oftentimes ask for accounts that have multi-factor authentication relaxed so that we can quickly perform all those tests inside the business logic of the application, and then test multi-factor separately, because it is obvious an exceptionally effective control. So let's just take a deep dive on one of those first examples. So the first finding was that the way the application was coded allowed for the rebalancing tool to be improperly leveraged. So one way that this could cause a problem, or it did in this case, was the execution of trades, real life trades at the custodian that should not have taken place. So, maybe maliciously, if somebody does choose to make this financial planning and portfolio management platform a target, it would be a malicious activity to, take a certain client's portfolio and turn it all to cash. Well, we need to make sure that we have controls in place that wouldn't allow them to do that. That would just be an example of what the bad actor would have been able to do in this case. So actionable insights, stricter validation for trade limits and risk tolerance constraints. So we're literally truly getting into the business logic of the application and using platforms like Burp Suite Professional to do this. Um, so this is an example of a type of thing that we might discover we could never discover with vulnerability scanning. Secondly, enhance audit logging for all trade-related activities. So our alerts in place for all atypical portfolio rebalance activities taking place. Oftentimes, from a compliance standpoint, this is already happening because we're looking to supervise financial advisors and what trading activity is taking place if they actually have the ability to do that. And then, making sure that we regularly test workflow logic to ensure that we fix such business logic errors. This is the second finding from this project is also exceptionally common. Okay. So the tester found that the advisor could access other advisors' client data by altering the client ID values. So when you're using an application, you're in, I'm going to pick on a great application where we've done vendor risk assessment and they have super strong security controls evidence through ISO 27001, but Orion would be example of an application where you might go query data about client X or XYZ or client XYZ01235. Well, what if I am actually allowed to change the parameters that the front end is querying, using to query the back end? And I'll just pick on this because this is such a really old example. But this is something we found when doing application penetration testing literally 8 years ago at a client that was using Statement One, Allbridge, as many of you know it today, where it was possible to, and this has since been fixed so that I'm going to share it. It's possible to literally pull back relatively easy at one time. This is 8+ years ago. Data about any client that might be associated with that broker dealer. So we want to make sure that we properly set up the front end and the SQL that is associated with the front end to ensure that a bad actor could not use the front end to access client data that they should not. Use secure, random, and non-sequential identifiers. Nothing easily guessed as it relates to performing queries. Apply strict access controls at the API level to ensure advisors can only access their own data. And then regularly conduct penetration testing to discover these sorts of vulnerabilities. Anything, Patrick, on these first two that you thought of as I was talking that you might bring up as a experienced tester?
Just reiterate, these are very common vulnerabilities to find when we're doing application penetration testing. IDOR is um, something that it ranked consistently in the top 10 worst or most common vulnerabilities found in application pen tests.
No. And sometimes, and we'll talk about this on next month's call, our secure software development processes using either dynamic or static testing might catch IDOR related issues, but not always. Insufficient security for client reports. Client financial reports were stored in the cloud without encryption and could be accessed directly via URLs. So, like I referenced earlier, and this is one we commonly see too in the software that many of you use in our industry because you have a fintech company that might have 10, 12 developers and have developed an amazing financial planning application and it was done at AWS and you know just really it didn't have both a good cloud security oriented team associated with those that were developing the application. The cloud is great, but the cloud also allows us to spin up and spin down new devices and servers and services so quickly that you really need to have a vulnerability scanning process that ensures that your cloud and the applications that are in the cloud are consistently being electronically scanned for, in this case, I reference vulnerability scanning because it might be something that would have picked up this third finding that we had that it is possible to directly access reports that are supposed to be secure by putting in a crazy set of URL codes on the internet. And if somehow and there are tools and it does give me some pause to think about what impact artificial intelligence is going to have in this whole area. So store sensitive client documents using encrypted storage. Always make sure that we've got authentication for anything accessible over the internet. And I mean, those are kind of obvious. And then, one of the basics, it's always referenced. Everybody should, multi-factor is one of our best friends. When you're, and I think most vendor risk management platforms, most certainly Buckler, always addresses the nature of and the use of and the requirement for multi-factor authentication. And that's just not on an admin accounts, but on on really anything accessible via the internet with a username and password. If there's confidential data there, and even if not confidential data, multi-factor should be used. So that's a quick, a quick case study on the types of things that might be found via application penetration test. Keep in mind, the New York DFS does require this, and it's set both from inside and outside system boundaries. So it's not just an external network penetration test. Oftentimes, good scanning done will be properly labeled an application, an external network penetration test, which is more akin to a vulnerability scan than it is to an actual penetration test. So it's required by the New York DFS, and this isn't all just about being compliant. Obviously, we want secure applications. Strengthen advisor authentication. Always use multi-factor, preferably via an authenticator that ensures that any tokens or codes that are being shared, that are being used for access, are also protected themselves. Work with firms that truly understand the business of financial planning, the types of software in the independent financial advice space, and then have the ability to properly perform testing with an understanding of the business logic associated with something like financial planning or portfolio management software. And then, of course, good, clean, secure document management. So that is kind of, and we have another case study. I think it's best with 5 minutes left to kind of just pause there um, and ask if there are any questions for Vincent, myself, or Patrick.
Thank you, Paul.
Vincent, other things that you would, some of that was kind of heavy content, but I think it's important for us to.
I think it's good. Just what I can say, Paul, is I think that when we say vulnerability scans, what you covered today was more the application vulnerability scan, and maybe in our language we should document it better because you're right. The other one that we do typically when it's not a software that we're auditing is just the network and the endpoints, huh?
Yeah, the point I want to make around vulnerability management is that it is an essential set of automated scanning that we should all have in place. It's kind of like table stakes, right? 5 years ago, hey, start using multi-factor authentication for anything accessed over the internet. That's kind of a basic requirement. Another basic requirement is ensuring that we're properly understanding where do we have unpatched devices, operating systems, or software applications. I detect that with a vulnerability scan, and now I have a process for all criticals will be remediated within X number of days, all highs within Y number of days, all mediums go to a committee where we're going to evaluate and sort those out. And then some process for understanding, do I have mitigating controls in place that may result in not all vulnerabilities being addressed because of compensating controls? So the key point around vulnerability management, we all need to be doing this. Oftentimes we'll do a risk assessment of, say, a financial advisor, and they'll say, do I really need to do vulnerability scanning?
Yes.
Yeah, you really need to do vulnerability scanning.
Okay. So no questions. So thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Paul. Really, really interesting. Deep content, but it's what we need. We need to dig.
Yeah. Be
Yep,
in
thanks
touch if you
for.
have other questions. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, everybody.
Yep.
Bye.